On this week's episode of the NESN Patriots podcast, we recap the first few weeks of training camp by sharing our thoughts on the Pats rookies and the difference in the offense under Bill O'Brien. Plus, the Patriots' philosophy of resting players seemingly has changed, but is it for the better? Hello and welcome back to the NESN Patriots podcast. I am Zach Cox, joined as always by Dakota Randall. We have watched 10 training camp practices for the New England Patriots. We're about to watch our 11th in just a couple of hours. And right now we are 3 days away from the Patriots' first preseason game Thursday night against the Houston Texans. Going to recap everything that we've seen so far, or as much as we can squeeze into one podcast episode here. Dakota, what's camp been like for you so far?
Yeah, I mean, I think the top takeaway so far is just the difference between this year and last year, just in that last year, the offense was obviously a complete disaster from start to finish. And it really was just the only thing that we talked about the entire time. It sort of dominated the whole zeitgeist surrounding training camp, from reporters to fans to the way it was talked about on radio. All that we talked about was Matt Patricia and Joe Judge and just how the offense couldn't do anything. And this year, it just feels more normal. That's not to say the offense looks amazing, because I still think there are some definite issues that we'll get into, especially on the offensive line. But it just looks like a more buttoned up professional operation, which has been good from our perspective because it's enabled us to actually really focus on players and focus on some other actual things besides just the calamity of the offense. So I think, that stood out. And I think for the third or fourth straight year, just some, interesting performances from rookies, which we'll also get into as well. So I think those two things, have really been big for me. And then I would say the third one, and I know we'll talk about this too, was the bizarre load management of stars and sort of the Bill Belichick going back on one of his chief tenets of, if you're healthy, you're practicing. A lot of different stuff happening this year. I think it sort of is a continuation of some stuff from last season with the Patriots taking more off days than usual. So that part is weird. But I think, those are the three big things for me.
Yeah, we're definitely going to hit on all three of those today. I think the offense is the obvious and most natural place to start. For anybody who didn't get out to Patriots training camp last summer and didn't see in person what the Patriots offense looked like a year ago, just take what you saw during the season and multiply that by 5 or 10 times. It was an absolute disaster out there last summer and last training camp. The Patriots could hardly even line up and run a simple running play successfully without 3 or 4 different things going wrong. And the players, especially the veteran players, got increasingly frustrated with that. And that's something that just sort of continued all the way through the season. So the bar coming into this year was very, very low, but the Patriots have certainly surpassed that. And they do look much more like a standard, usual NFL offense. I think Mac Jones kind of hit the nail on the head when he said back in the spring that it just feels normal. And that's what we've seen so far. You're not coming out to these practices looking at the Patriots and saying, oh my God, this looks like Patrick Mahomes and the Chiefs, or this looks like the 2007 Patriots. They're going to score 45 points a game. That hasn't really been the takeaway, but it's just much more of a professional outfit than it was last year. Mike Gesicki talked about it a couple days ago. He said the discipline on offense has been really good. And that's what we've seen so far as well. You haven't seen the false starts. You haven't seen the alignment issues. You haven't seen just kind of blatant blocking breakdowns. So certainly moving in the right direction under Bill O'Brien, who everybody on the team seems to love. I mean, based on all the players that we've talked to, it's been nothing but kind of rave reviews about O'Brien, and the Patriots are certainly trending in the proper direction offensively. But again, that bar was so low last year that I don't think trending in the right direction and better than last year necessarily means that the Patriots offense is completely fixed and is going to be absolutely okay and be a top 5 unit in the NFL this year. That may end up being the case, but there are some significant questions still, most notably the one that you mentioned on the offensive line. I mean, at practice yesterday, the Patriots were missing 4 of their preferred 5 starting offensive linemen. There was no Trent Brown, no Cole Strange, no Mike Owenu, and then no David Andrews. We don't know what the deal was with him. That could have been a veteran rest day type thing. But there's not a lot of proven depth up there. And so far, their preferred starters have not really been able to stay on the field. So to me, I don't know what your opinion is, but going into the season, offensively, that offensive line has to be kind of the number one concern for this team.
Yeah, far and away. I think, if things go south for the Patriots, particularly on offense, it'll be because of the offensive line. And it's puzzling going into the offseason and the draft and free agency. We said the number one thing they need to do one of the top things they needed to do was address the tackle issue. And they just really didn't do it. I mean, I know they got Riley Reif and I know they got Calvin Anderson, but one of those guys in Reif as a guy on the back end of his career who is probably back up at this point, and the other guy is Anderson, who at his best is probably a good swing tackle, but probably not someone that you want starting 17 games at right tackle. And then they drafted Sidi Zhao or so, the guard who now they've really been putting at tackle, but he's really only been playing with third stringers and doesn't look like he's ready. So at the very least, I feel like right tackle is going to be an issue. Especially, if it looks like Connor McDermott's sort of locked up that right tackle spot at this point, which is a concern. I think it has to be. And then on the other side, Trent Brown, historically unreliable, be that effort, be that injuries, be that performance. Sometimes when he's at his best, he's one of the best left tackles in the game, but he's not always at his best and he's not always on the field. So you can manage around one bad tackle spot. I think that's kind of the Bill O'Brien difference there, where if you're weak at one, you can figure it out. But 2, I don't know if there's any way of solving that. So I think that's a huge concern, which is why I think, the Trent Brown load management thing and the contract issue, I think he knows that, he has, I think, a decent amount of leverage against the Patriots because he knows how important he is. So it'll be interesting to see what sort of resolution there is to that situation. But yeah, I agree with you. The offensive line is a big concern, and it's only gotten worse as camp has gone on, when of course you want the opposite to be true.
Yeah, I think if the Patriots have their top starting 5 out there, I think they'll be fine. I don't think it's one of the best offensive lines in the NFL by any means, but
I think it's high upside though, for sure.
If everybody's in there and healthy, especially on the interior, that interior could be one of the better ones in the NFL if Cole Strange makes some strides in year 2. But if you get Trent Brown at left tackle, Cole Strange at left guard, David Andrews at center, Mike Owenu at right guard, and then, as you mentioned, probably Connor McDermott as it's looking at right tackle, I think you can get by with that unit, especially with Bill O'Brien being able to scheme things up much better than Matt Patricia could last year. But if you start losing 1, 2, 3 guys from that group, the depth really gets tested. I mean, you go just kind of one rung down on the depth chart from what we've seen so far. It's a lot of young players who don't have much NFL experience, and the ones who do have NFL experience haven't really been starting caliber players. You look at what they have at tackle. Trent Brown, everybody knows what he can be, but also what the issues with him are. But Riley Reif, Connor McDermott, and Calvin Anderson all were not week 1 starters last season. We haven't seen Calvin Anderson get onto the field at all. We've seen him out there a couple times. He's still on the non-football injury list. We don't really know whether that's an imminent return type situation or something that's going to sideline him for the foreseeable future. But he hasn't been able to get out there on the field at training camp at all. Riley Reif seemingly was surpassed at right tackle by Connor McDermott in the first couple of days of camp. He's been out there a lot at left tackle with Trent Brown, kind of present, but not really doing much of anything. But again, I think if they have those top 5, they're in decent shape. But who goes through an entire season without losing 1 or 2 offensive linemen? So I think the depth and the kind of overall quality there remains a big question mark.
Yeah. And I think the other issue is, there's a domino effect where if you're weak on the right side, one of the first solutions is, keep the tight end in to help out. The problem with that is, one of the ideas with the Bill O'Brien offense is we get back to this 2 tight end system with Hunter Henry, Mike Gesicki. The Patriots don't have a high end receiver, the DeAndre Hopkins or whoever, but you looked at it and said, well, their total assortment of weapons can sort of be greater than the sum of their parts, especially if you're getting a lot from the 2 tight ends. Now, Mike Gesicki actually hasn't really, I wasn't at practice yesterday, but in totality, he hasn't done much. I think you can make
quiet camp. Yeah.
yeah, I think you can make the case that Matt Sokol has been better to this point, maybe. But again, if you having to keep Hunter Henry in to help out with the right side of the line, then all of a sudden you're not really getting that two tight end attack that you were hoping for. And it puts more stress on your average to a slightly above average assortment of receivers. So again, I don't think you can oversell how important it is for them to figure out the situation at tackle to at least just be manageable.
Yeah. And moving on to those receivers and those skill players, obviously we've talked and written a lot about how the Patriots, in most people's minds, do not have that kind of Pro Bowl caliber number one pass catcher, be it a tight end or a wide receiver, that basically every contending team in the NFL has at least one of. The Patriots have a lot of twos, a lot of threes. I think they're pretty deep, and I think they're certainly better off at those spots this year, at least on paper, than they were in the last 3-4 years. But they don't have that kind of game-changing type talent, the type of player that a DeAndre Hopkins would have been if the Patriots had brought him in. But it's been interesting to hear kind of the internal mindset of this group. We were talking to Kendrick Bourne after practice yesterday, and he got a question from Mike Giardi, who's covered the Patriots forever. He was pretty critical of the Patriots receivers during a TV interview a couple of weeks back, and Bourne definitely heard that. He basically threw Giardi's line right back in his face, the stink stank stunk thing that people have probably seen on Twitter the last couple of days. The Patriots internally think that they're a lot better at receiver than a lot of kind of external observers and pundits believe they are. We heard JuJuSmith-Schuster say last week that he believes the Patriots have 3 number one receivers, not 0. So we'll see. This group is basically in kind of full prove the doubters wrong kind of mode. But there's a lot of pressure on that group because there hasn't been nobody in the current receiving core that they have has ever really carried a team's passing game. Even someone like Smith-Schuster, he's always been at his best when he has an Antonio Brown or Travis Kelce on the field with him. So it's another real big question mark for this offense is, do they have enough talent at those spots?
Yeah. And I think the interesting about them is if you look at their receiver group and if you could just guarantee that everybody stayed healthy and played like up to their capability or reach their ceiling, I think you could argue that they would actually have one of the better receiver groups in the league, at least the deepest, because JuJuSmith-Schuster, he's only 26 right now. He's, and I know it was 5 years ago or so, but he had 1,400 yards. Devontae Parker, who has an 1,100 yard, 7 touchdown season under his belt. Kendrick Bourne, 800 yards a few years ago, sort of receiver on the upswing, fast, brings that sort of twitchiness to their offense that a lot of those guys don't have. And then Tyquan Thornton, who may be the biggest X factor, who hasn't been out there much during camp, hasn't looked good when he's been out there. But you're like, if he plays up to what we thought as a second rounder with the speed and look, sometimes in practice, he looks like more than just a speed guy. If he plays up to that, and then what we've seen from Demario Douglas, and then you add in the 2 tight ends, if Hunter Henry goes back to 2 years ago, if Mike Gesicki does what he can do, you're like, that's actually a really good group, especially when you add in Ramondre Stevenson. I think the problem is, I don't think anybody in the right mind looks at the group and thinks that you're going to get that. Maybe that's fair. Maybe it's not. But I think, given the injury history and just sort of the up and down nature of the way some of those guys have been over the last few years, and the fact that we've seen nothing from Thornton during the 2 seasons to suggest he's going to deliver, and Demario Douglas is a rookie, I think, there is reason to be concerned that this group isn't going to be good enough. But if you want to be a glass half full person, you can squint and see a path toward it being much better than people expect.
Yeah, I think they're certainly, as I mentioned before, they're in better shape this year than they have been probably since 2019, maybe even earlier, maybe even 2018, just from a talent perspective. I know a lot of Patriots fans on social media they basically are still acting like this is Damiere Byrd and Gunnar Olszewski and guys kind of rounding out this receiving core. There are a lot of quality NFL players in this pass catching group that have had success in the past. It's just, as you mentioned there, it's a kind of perfect world scenario.
Ricochet shot at Damiere Byrd.
He actually, sorry to Damiere. He actually had a pretty good year with Cam Newton that year, but yeah, they're in better shape now than they have been in the past. But the guaranteeing that you're going to get that from all of them is a tough ask. And I'm glad you brought up Thornton, because that's where I was going to go next. I know you wrote last week that he's been one of the most disappointing players in Patriots training camp, and he is continuing to trend downward based on what we saw yesterday, Sunday, at practice. We saw him miss a couple of days last week with an apparent injury, or he was at practice but didn't really do much. And then yesterday, when the Patriots split their receivers early in practice, they do these kind of non-competitive, unopposed route running drills where the receivers are catching passes from the quarterbacks. They've been doing them in most practices. They split them up at the beginning. It's the kind of starting-ish players on one side, and then all the roster bubble guys on the other side. And for most of camp, it had been JuJuSmith-Schuster, Devontae Parker, Kendrick Bourne, Tyquan Thornton, and Demario Douglas, the rookie, working with Mac Jones during those periods, and then everybody else working with Bailey Zappi and Trace McSorley. On Sunday, we saw Smith-Schuster, Parker, Bourne, and Douglas working with Mac Jones, but Tyquan Thornton was down with the twos, was down with guys like Kayshon Boutte and Malik Cunningham and Trey Nixon. And that was a pretty significant shift in my mind. Tyquan Thornton was a second-round pick last year. I don't think he's in danger of getting cut. That would be a pretty major roster move, but he seems to have fallen behind Demario Douglas, who is having a phenomenal camp so far on that wide receiver depth chart. He did end up getting some reps with Mac Jones in 7-on-7s and 11-on-11s, but he still hasn't caught a single pass from Jones in competitive drills all camp, and just really hasn't, I would say he hasn't had an impressive practice that we've been able to see since that first OTA way back in May, whenever that was. And it's not what you're looking to see from a guy who really did not have an especially impressive rookie year.
Yeah, and I think the biggest concern is that the things we worried about with him when he entered the league have started to come to fruition, not just durability. That has been part of it too. And again, he bulked up a little bit during the offseason, but he's still really skinny, really lean. So yeah, durability has been an issue, but also just the physicality of the NFL. You wonder if he's up for it. I mean, there have been multiple times during camp where, he's gotten out muscled by cornerbacks, or there have been sort of contested catches, like a bang bang play. I remember early on, Christian Gonzalez just sort of got in there a little bit, and Thornton, like, you'd want him to be tougher on the ball and come up with that, and he just didn't come up with it. There have been a lot of instances like that from him. And so you don't have to be a super physical, strong receiver to get by in the NFL. But I don't know if he's, slick or smooth enough to make up for that, like a Brandon Lloyd. Maybe that's not a great example, but a guy who wasn't super physical, but was so smooth in everything else he did that it didn't matter sometimes. Thornton's kind of a weird player. It looks more and more like he is really going to have to rely on his speed and athleticism. But even that, so far, we haven't really been able to see too much of it. And I think the biggest concern is he just isn't getting a lot of targets. I mean, when they were doing that red zone work early in training camp, a lot of times he wasn't even on the field. And when he was, they didn't really look at him, which, I mean, indicates to me that they don't really trust him down there. So again, it's early. Things can change. There have been a lot of practices, or a lot of times when he has looked really good last summer. And like you said, that OTA practice, like we've seen it, it isn't sustained, or there's an injury that breaks it up, or, when it comes to game action, he doesn't deliver, because he got back last year and played a lot, but it never looked like it did when he was at his best during camp. So I'm not totally out on him, but I'm certainly not all in on him. I think this is a huge couple of weeks for him coming up.
Yeah, that physicality that you mentioned was a real issue for him in Sunday's practice. I had the Patriots defense down for 5 pass breakups in that practice. 3 of them came on throws to Tyquan Thornton. 2 of those were kind of contested catch type plays. I believe it was one against Joshua Bledsoe and one against Rodney Randall, the kind of depth cornerback. And those issues were apparent on those plays. He doesn't have the kind of strength and physicality really, or hasn't shown that consistently enough to outmuscle defenders on plays like that. It was interesting to me to see Mac Jones stick around after practice and throw individually with Thornton for an extra 10 minutes or so yesterday. So he's still working on building that relationship and trying to trying to kind of improve that connection that hasn't really been there so far. But I totally agree. This is a very important couple of weeks for Thornton, who, again, I don't think is in danger of losing his spot on the team, but certainly could fall out of the offensive mix in the offensive plan this season if he doesn't change some things over these couple of weeks before the season begins.
Yeah, and one other quick point I wanted to make on him too, and this isn't the most fair criticism, but I do think there's something to be said for just the mindset or the intangibles that a receiver, especially a high draft pick, brings to the table. And I just don't think at any point watching him, I've ever seen him go out and just really assert himself. And whether it just be dominate or just sort of have a loud practice where maybe talk a little trash, maybe go out and there's a really like the competitive rep against someone, you come up with it, and I'll play that maybe you shouldn't have, but you came up with it, made a statement, made some noise, or had a little alpha dog in you that you like to see. I don't think every receiver needs to have that per se, but I think there's something to be said for, you look at a lot of the best guys in the NFL, they bring that. Like when they make a big play in practice, it, they know it, everyone knows it, and it leaves an impression. Even guys that are in the second round, we saw that clip of George Pickens getting one over Joey Porter in practice, and he let him know about it. So, he made his presence felt. And I just don't know, Tyquan Thornton doesn't seem like he has that. He's more of a quiet guy. Again, that doesn't mean he can't be a good player, but, you're just searching for something to make you believe a little bit. And I think at the end of the day, you would prefer your receivers to have that. And I think the same can be said for cornerbacks too, which is why, one of the few criticisms of Christian Gonzalez is, does he have that sort of Sauce Gardner-like mentality? We don't know. Do you need it? Not necessarily, but you'd like to see it. So that's one thing I'd also like to see more from Thornton, is go into a practice saying, I'm going to be one of the best players on the field, make it happen, and then make sure everybody knows about it. I think, he could stand to gain some of that.
I mean, that Pickens situation, that's going to be tied to Thornton for the rest of his career, because the Patriots traded up, drafted Thornton right before the Steelers drafted George Pickens, and Pickens so far has looked like the more impressive NFL player. But you mentioned Christian Gonzalez. I think it's a good time to transition over to the Patriots rookies. When Robert Kraft spoke to NFL Network, I believe it was back in May, he said he was really, really happy with the Patriots draft this year, and it made him very optimistic, I believe his words were, for the future of the team. Obviously way too early to draw any real conclusions about any of these rookie players, but so far it's been an impressive showing by this rookie class as a whole. I think you could probably count 7, 8, 9 rookies who have flashed in some way or another during this training camp for the Patriots. It's been unusual to see as many rookies both playing in significant roles, and even the ones who aren't in the mix with those first teams still making plays on the field and flashing in positive ways. Who's the rookie who has stood out to you most so far? I think I probably know your answer.
Yeah, it's either Demario Douglas or Marte Mapu. I'll just go with Mapu, just because to see a guy playing really at all three levels of the defense as a rookie has been pretty amazing. I mean, right from OTAs, they put him out there with the first team defense, both as a free safety, as an outside linebacker. We've seen him sort of in that star role too. Just I haven't been in a lot of Patriots training camps, but from what everyone has told me that has, and just watching the Patriots over the years, you typically don't see that kind of trust and that sort of workload for rookie defenders, especially ones that are like sort of middle round picks. So I think that's been really impressive. The way he sort of handles himself in the media availabilities is really, you can sort of sense like a real confidence to him, almost like a Dante Hightower, like, if that makes sense.
Yeah, real maturity.
Yeah, like you can just it feels like he's going places and fast. The Patriots have needed more of that on defense, and I think he could be an immediate impact player. We'll see if he comes back, when he gets the non-contact jersey off, but I think he's really, really stood out for me.
Yeah, I'm hoping we get to see Mapu on the field Thursday night against the Texans. Not sure if that's going to happen just yet, because as you mentioned, he's still practicing in the red non-contact jersey, tore his pec before the draft, still working his way back from that. Hasn't really looked limited in any way from what we've seen, but he did say that he still has a little bit of a ways to go. So it wouldn't be super surprising if the Patriots hold him out of this game just until he is fully healed. But yeah, he's been impressive so far. It's been pretty remarkable just to hear his teammates talk about him. I think Adrian Phillips was raving about his intelligence and his kind of inquisitiveness. The other day, he says he's just basically spends all day asking questions to everybody in the building, which I'm sure can get a little bit annoying if you're on the receiving end of all those questions. But it just shows how the approach that Mapu is taking in his rookie year seems to be basically exactly what you would want from a rookie, especially one who's seemingly going to play a bunch of different positions on the Patriots defense. And you could see as many as 3 rookies playing significant roles in this Patriots defense this year, because Christian Gonzalez, who you mentioned earlier, seems at this point like almost a lock to be one of the Patriots starting cornerbacks rather. They've rotated people at one of those outside cornerback spots in pretty much each practice. You've seen John Jones, you've seen Jack Jones, Marcus Jones in there a little bit, but the other one has been Christian Gonzalez basically 100% of the time since the start of training camp. And I wouldn't say it's been a phenomenal camp for Gonzalez. He's definitely shown some promise, had some very good moments. He has not looked kind of out of his depth in that starting role against starting caliber players, but he also had some difficult matchups against Devontae Parker. He's had some losses in coverage against guys like Smith-Schuster and Bourne. There's been some growing pains, which you would expect from a guy who, in addition to being a first-round pick, is also the youngest player on the Patriots roster. I don't think, based on what we've seen, at least so far, that you're going to see Gonzalez come out and look like Sauce Gardner from week 1. But right. I've definitely been encouraged overall with kind of his body of work so far, especially since he is going up against basically the most difficult matchups that the Patriots can throw at him in training camp. And then Keon White, another guy on the defensive line, seems to be a multi-positional type player. We've seen him stand up on the edge. We've seen him down at defensive end. He's been in the backfield a lot for kind of quote unquote sacks. So you're not actually allowed to hit the quarterback in these practices. You don't really know what would be a sack and what hasn't been. But he's been in the mix there a lot too. What have you noticed from Gonzalez and White so far?
Yeah, I think with Gonzalez, the main thing is once the pads came on, it seemed like it got a little bit tougher for him, which you'd expect. And again, he's not the biggest guy. But I think overall, he looks really good. I mean, he is a quiet guy, doesn't have a ton to say at the podium. So, again, don't expect a Sauce Gardner like player. But again, like you said, you've seen all the things that people said before the draft that would lead you to believe he can be a really good cornerback in this league. But as you said, I'd be surprised if he came out and just dominates at the start of the season. Like, I'd be surprised if in that first game against the Eagles, the Patriots just put Gonzalez on AJ Brown and say, go handle it. Like, I don't think
man him up all game, go handle it.
Yeah. I don't, that feels like John Jones. You go do that for, you take that today. But we'll see. But I think he's been good. And I think Keon White, his workload has increased. It seems like he's Dietrich Wise 2.0. The question is, I think, how are they going to find playing time for him? Someone's got to go. I've been kind of doing the math in my head, like which defensive lineman could be cut. Is it Sam Roberts? Is it Daniel Aquale? Sort of different versions of that, because Keon White, I think, is going to have to play. I mean, he's a 2nd-round pick. But you just wonder how much, like, is Bill Belichick going to take Dietrich Wise off the field to play Keon White? I'd be surprised. But he looks really good. He's big. He's explosive. And I think certainly maybe by the end of the season, you could see him start to pop a little bit. But yeah, those guys have been great. The interior offensive linemen that they got in the middle rounds, tough to say. They've some of them have had to play, like Antonio Mafi, with the injuries to the O-line. Some of them have been really with the second team. City Zoe has been like the 3rd team right tackle. So hard to tell. I think we'll get a better idea once joint practices start for those guys, as we will everybody, really.
Yeah, and I think the rookie specialists also have been kind of quiet standouts of camp so far. Just quiet in the terms of not a lot of people pay a ton of attention to the kicker and punter competitions, but Bryce Barringer, the rookie punter out of Michigan State, really powerful leg. He's looked very good from what we've seen from, I'm not a punting expert. I haven't seen a enormous, gigantic difference between him and Corliss Waitman, but some folks who are a little more in tune with the particulars of punting have been very impressed with Barringer so far. And then with Chad
I was gonna say the guy, other people on the beat who love them some punting are trying to make a case for nicknaming Barringer the stopwatch because of his hang times.
That's a lame nickname.
I think so too. Yeah.
We got to workshop that a little bit.
I think so too.
But
But yeah, because like he's always over 5 seconds, whereas Waitman is more around like 4.75 and too much punter talk. But that's he had some Behringer had some really impressive kicks during that in-stadium practice. But yeah, both those guys have been good.
Yeah, and then Chad Ryland as well. He's competing with Nick Folk at the kicker spot. I think it's going to be a situation where he'll have to prove in these preseason games that he can actually kick with accuracy reliably, but his leg strength compared to Folk has been significantly stronger. You're seeing him boom 50-yard field goals very far through the uprights, where Nick Folk had one last week. I think it was from like 45 or 47 that didn't even reach the crossbar. So we saw something similar from Quinn Nordine a couple of years ago, and then he went out in preseason games and was just shooting the ball all over the place. So it'll have to be Ryland will have to kind of prove that he can do it reliably, but he is, I would say, the strong favorite to beat out Nick Folk right now, both in terms of leg strength and in terms of draft status. You're not going to draft a kicker in the 4th round and then cut him in training camp unless he is very, very bad. And Chad Ryland has certainly not been very, very bad so far.
But that said, if Bill Belichick does indeed have 2 kickers make the 53-man roster, I will hand him my 2 weeks notice. I will stop covering this football team. And
I wouldn't
resign.
He might have like 2 kickers for like situational purposes. He's like, Nick,
he didn't rule it out.
You're our sub 40-yard kicker, and we're going to use Chad for the ones over 50 yards.
Like, would it surprise you at all if he's like, yeah, we're going to put in Nick Folk for all the extra points and Chad Ryland for everything over 40 yards and on kickoffs? Like, I'm not going to be, if that happens, and if someone like Daniel Aquali or Sam Roberts loses a roster spot because Bill Belichick needs to keep 2 kickers, again, I will quit and I will go home and play video games.
I mean, I would disagree with that move, but it would not shock me at all based on Bill Belichick's history and how he loves him some kickers. And we should also note before we move on from the rookies, the rookie wideouts. You mentioned Demario Douglas earlier. I'd say overall, if you're naming a single biggest standout or riser or winner or however you want to term it, I think Douglas has to be on the very, very short list for that. He's gotten work with Mac Jones in the top offense in every practice. He's looks great as a route runner. His hands look great. He even shown up well as a blocker and as a ball carrier in the open field. Seen some work as a kick returner and a punt returner. His teammates really seem to be impressed by him. And at this point, he seems to be well in the roster conversation. I mean, he hasn't even played a preseason game yet, so I guess you can't really call him a roster lock, but he is. Yeah, he seems to be as close as you can be to a roster lock as a 6th round rookie who has not played a game. So
well, let me ask you, you were in camp in 2019 when Jacoby Myers sort of surprised as like the rookie receiver standout. Like, who do you think has been better to this point or more impressive consistently, Demario Douglas or Jacoby Myers back then?
I would say
different players, but
I would say Douglas, just because he, from an opportunity standpoint, like in that camp, Jacoby was very impressive, but he wasn't like repping with Tom Brady all the time. It was more kind of, he was playing well with the lower level receivers. And then eventually he kind of rose up the ranks over the course of camp, where Douglas has, even though most of his competitive reps, his 11-on-11 catches and whatnot have come from Zappy. He's the fact that the Patriots from day one of camp were like, all right, you're going to be working with Mac in most of these kind of walk through install type drills. That's been pretty notable to me, certainly. And then Kayshon Boutte is the other Patriots rookie. He's a guy that both of us were pretty down on coming out of the spring. Didn't really do much at all in the first week of training camp. I would still put him in the roster long shot category at the moment, but he's shown up well in 3 straight practices, seen some work with Mac Jones, had a nice touchdown catch from Zappy yesterday, looked pretty good in one-on-ones last week. I think he had a win against Christian Gonzalez and another one against Jonathan Jones. So he's definitely moving in the right direction. And I think for him, just from a talent standpoint and a potential standpoint, like this was a guy who was the 2nd ranked receiver recruit in the nation just a couple of years ago, was really good at LSU for his first year and a half there. He has kind of steal of the draft potential if he puts everything together. I'm not saying that that's going to happen. Again, I still think that he is on the outside looking in terms of a roster spot at this point. But it's been nice to see some kind of positive movement from him after what he admitted was a pretty slow start to his Patriots career.
Yeah, I think the one thing that, I'm waiting to see from him is just like the explosion that you saw at LSU, right? Like when he would take a 5-yard slant to the house, or, he'd catch a 20-yard pass on the boundary, make a couple guys miss, and he's gone for like an extra 25, 30 yards after the catch. Like, he was ridiculous after the catch that first year at LSU. Then he got hurt. The second year wasn't totally back last year. And it seemed like, in addition to the off-field stuff, the coachability, the work ethic concerns, it seemed like there was a concern that he'd lost a lot of the explosion, whether it be from the injury or whatever, that he just wasn't the same player. And so, I think that's kind of tracked so far in camp. Like, I think he looks decent. He definitely has good ball skills. He makes good catches, but like, you're not seeing that extra gear that I think made him such a big prospect a couple years ago. But maybe it will come in time. We'll just have to see.
He's got to get rid of the number 58. He looks slow in number 58. It's hard to look fast when you're wearing the offensive tackle number. Patriots rookies will get their actual real numbers this week, which will be very nice. We can no longer have to try to differentiate between Keon White and Ronnie Perkins both wearing number 51 and being on the field at the same time. So
yeah, I just think it's the one more thing on the wideouts. I mean, the more as you're talking about those other guys, I'm thinking about it, like, outside of Malik Cunningham, I think Tyquan Thornton has probably been the least impressive or the worst receiver in camp. Part of that's because he hasn't played, but outside of Malik Cunningham, like, I think you could definitely say that, and not like Kendrick Bourne has done a lot, but I think the top three guys have been better. Douglas has been better. I think you could say at this point, Kayshon Boutte has been about the same, if not better. Trey Nixon's made more plays, and I think you could say that Raleigh Webb has been better. I think that's 100% fair to say that Raleigh Webb has been better. So that's just, Thornton is sort of plummeting down the depth chart, and he's got a lot of ground to make up. So,
absolutely. Before we wrap up here, we mentioned the kind of different feel of Patriots training camp this year. The quote unquote load management, as it's called in the NBA. It's popular around the NFL as well. Most teams practice some form of it, be it kind of veteran rest days or dialing back a guy's workload. For the Patriots, that wasn't the case for the longest time. Bill Belichick had always kind of been of the mind that if you are healthy, you are going to practice. You're going to practice as much as you possibly can based on whatever your health status is. We saw a bit of a shift away from that last summer, where Devin McCourty had a lighter workload in training camp. Matthew Slater had a lighter workload in training camp. But both of those players, even when they did have their workloads diminished, they were still kind of on the field with the team. It wasn't as visible. You would have to be kind of paying close attention to say, oh man, McCourty hasn't been in any of these reps in this drill. This year, it's seemingly expanded significantly. I mean, Matthew Judon was not a full participant in practice until yesterday, Sunday. Some of that certainly was related to the fact that he was in active contract negotiations on a new reworked deal that he ultimately got done Friday night. But we've also seen, as we mentioned, Trent Brown has done very little in Patriots training camp. He's been at every practice, but most days has not been involved in team drills. Maybe that's something contractually related as well, because as you mentioned, Brown does seemingly have a fair bit of leverage at the moment. I would say not as much as Matthew Judon, just based on the performance he's had over the last couple of years. But Ramondre Stevenson as well is probably the poster child for this, because he's entering his third year. By NFL rules, he is not allowed to get any sort of contract adjustment. He can't get an extension. He can't rework his contract. And yet he was essentially a non-participant in the Patriots' first two padded practices, and also one of their early non-padded practices as well. So that's a guy where there are no contractual kind of considerations, and the Patriots are still dialing it back with him. I'd say a lot of this makes sense, especially with a guy like Stevenson, a guy like Judon, two enormously important players who both kind of wore down toward the end of last season. For Judon, that's happened 2 years in a row now. So it's not a kind of controversial move, it's just very different from what we've always seen from Bill Belichick.
Yeah, it's weird. I think on the one hand, if it is just about the load management for certain players, that's one thing, even though again, it goes against that if you're healthy, you're practicing. Because yeah, that's what Bill Belichick always has been about, but things change, sports science changes. Like, I'm okay with that. What I do think is a concern is, and again, this is kind of the reality of when you're not so good and perennially a Super Bowl contender that you can kind of just do whatever you want. But if you start allowing someone like Trent Brown, who, he played a full season last year, but again, peaks and valleys, and then he basically holds out of the spring. When he does show up, he's out of shape. And then when he comes back, if it's true that he wants a new contract and it's kind of like a hold in where he's not going to put himself out there, even though he's healthy, but he wants a new contract. If the Patriots then reward him with the contract, what kind of message does that send? It's one thing with Matthew Judon, but even in that case, it's a guy who showed up, he was healthy, but he didn't practice, and eventually the Patriots gave him the contract. I just think it's what kind of message does that send to the younger players? If you're trying to sort of reestablish the Patriots culture post Brady. And then the Jack Jones thing the other day, I mean,
yeah,
how many times
we didn't even mention that? Yeah.
How many times have we, Jack Jones now, if it's true that he sort of showed up Bill Belichick when he got that suspension, obviously the gun arrest, and then who knows what happened in practice the other day. Sure looked like he got kicked out. Some people seem to believe that maybe Jack Jones just like kind of lost his mind and left the field on his own. If that part is true, if he just left on his own and then came back and just sort of got on one knee and watched practice from afar, I mean, that feels like something Bill Belichick never would have let happen in the past. So you just kind of wonder, like, what's the vibe going on here? And, what can players get away with now that they couldn't in the past? And again, as you're trying to reestablish the culture, what message do you send to the younger players about what they can do, what they can get away with? And again, I think part of it comes down to they need Matthew Judon, they need Trent Brown, and they kind of need Jack Jones too, when you don't really know what Christian Gonzalez is going to be this year. And again, like in the past, you had the luxury where if all three of those guys go down, whatever, you got Tom Brady, you're going to figure it out. The rest of the team stinks and the AFC East stinks. Those things aren't true anymore, and they need those players. So there's clearly at least a little bit more leeway than there was in the past. And I just think you could argue that is a slippery slope. So I just think it'll be interesting to keep an eye on going forward.
Yeah, the Jack Jones situation was bizarre the other day because you would think that if he got kicked out of practice, he wouldn't have come back to practice, which he did about 20 minutes later.
Right.
And it also didn't seem to have any real ramifications for him because he was back to being a full participant in Sunday's practice, even got some reps with the first team defense. So it wasn't I don't know. It's bizarre. We haven't really gotten any intel on exactly what happened with that play or why he got kicked out or why he came back. It's been a very odd summer for Jack Jones. And then overall, the kind of shift that we were talking about, it's been interesting to hear a couple of former Patriots players comment on this, because Rob Ninkovich and Rob Gronkowski were both pretty critical of this whole situation. Last week, I believe it was right before Judon got his new contract, they were kind of criticizing both him for not practicing and the Patriots for allowing him to not practice and sort of changing the standard that they had for so long. So yeah, it's been a kind of a fascinating shift to observe here.
Yeah, and again, it's 2 years in a row now, different, but so last year was just and again, I wasn't here in years prior, so I can't compare it, but like weekends off basically every week. A lot of off time, a lot of
lighter. Yeah,
a lot of lighter practices. And so that's been a little bit different this year. They've practiced more, but there's been a lot more of this load management. And I still wouldn't say like a lot of these practices have been very intense, even with the pads on. And part of that might just be current state of the NFL. It's different now. You don't go all out in training camp because of player health. I get that. But just in general, like when I joined the beat 2 years ago, 3 years ago, I didn't join in time to do that training camp, the Cam Newton, Mac Jones training camp. But, I came in with a certain idea of like what Patriots training camp is going to be like. Like I felt like it was going to be this gauntlet run by Bill Belichick. And it just hasn't happened in the last few years. And it's been interesting. And so you just wonder how much of that is changing of the times, how much of that is just the reality of where the Patriots are right now. They don't have the luxury of being able to rule the iron fist like they used to. But it's a not insignificant sidebar, I think.
One of many things that is very different post Tom Brady. Real quick before we sign off, who's one player you're excited to watch Thursday night?
Ooh, good question. I am going to say if Marte Mapu is not playing because he still hasn't been cleared for contact, then I'll go Demario Douglas. If Mapu can play, then I'd like to see him play, because one of the biggest things of him coming out of college, yeah, we talked about the versatility, talked about the mental aspect of the game, but like it was also the fact that he was just a missile at Sacramento State. Like hitting hard was like one of his biggest things, like maybe the biggest calling card. And we like, despite all this praise we've given him and all this, how great he's looked, he hasn't even been able to hit anybody. So it would be fun to see him finally like be let out of the cage a little bit. But if not, then Demario Douglas, I think for sure.
Those two players are at the top of my list as well. Also going to be very interesting to see if they put Christian Gonzalez out in this game, because typically the Patriots don't really play their expected starters in this first game, but since he is a rookie, they may want to give him some actual game reps. So basically this entire rookie class, based on years past, should play a lot in this game. And there are a lot of interesting players to watch in that group, certainly. And that will do it for this week's episode of the NESN Patriots podcast. You can follow me on Twitter at Zach Cox NESN. You can follow Dakota at Dak Randall NESN. And you can follow along with all of our Patriots training camp and preseason coverage. We've got joint practices coming up next week in Green Bay, following week in Nashville. So there'll be plenty of good stuff coming your way. You can follow along with all of that on NESN.com.